All right, everybody, thank you. Shall we come to order? A warm welcome to those attending and also our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. This is the meeting of the External Services Select Committee, and my name is Councillor John Riley, and I'm the chairman of this meeting. The key role of this committee is to monitor the performance of local public services within its remit and to hold in-depth reviews on topics of resident interest. We engage with a range of external witnesses in our activity, which can include community groups, residents, and subject matter experts. Where we identify areas for change or improvement, we make recommendations to the decision-making cabinet. Details of the business to be considered today are shown on the agenda, copies of which are available in the room and also accessible on YouTube underneath the broadcast. For those present in the room and intending to speak, please note that you will be filmed and any statements you make will be recorded and made in public. And for those in the public gallery, you won't be on camera. A reminder to councillors, officers and those speaking today that you should turn the microphone button on when speaking, and this will ensure that you can be heard in the room and by those watching online. What we'll do, as we often do in this committee, is that when you speak for the first time, if you could just say who you are and where you're from, that'll be very helpful. And so we shall start. So, apologies for absence, please.
Chairman, we've had apologies from Councillor Harangi, and Councillor Steve Tuckwell is here as her substitute.
Excellent, thank you. Welcome, Councillor Tuckwell. Declarations of interest in any matters coming before the meeting, apart from all the usual ones? No? All right, thank you. And just to say that all items that are in Part 1 will be in public. We haven't got any Part 2 items, so we don't need to worry about that. All right, minutes of the previous meeting. The last meeting, and just so that people understand, this committee deals essentially with two very big subjects. One in relation to all the health trusts and health partners that report to or have anything to do with the borough, and then the other side of the work that we do is all the other services, and in particular the civilian services, police, fire brigade, London Ambulance and other organisations, and that's what we're doing this evening. So the last minutes were on the 9th of July and were one of our fairly considerable health meetings. I'm not going to spend a heck of a lot of time going through all of them, but if anyone's got anything particular that they want to raise from the last minutes, then please do. We've dealt with various topics. Hospice provision in the north of the borough. There were a number of resolutions there. Page 4, at the bottom of item 16, resolved that Caroline Morrison from CCG would be provided with written representations from the committee and Michael Sobelhouse, and I think we've probably done that. Mm-hmm. And presentations were then noted. Then we had a number of health updates from the various health trusts, and then you'll see on page 11 of the minutes that there were a number of matters that were resolved to be dealt with from items 1 through to 9. And I think those are all matters which will come back to us, in fact, in the November meeting, when we get an update or further updates from our health partners. And then we dealt with the work programme, and that was that really. So anybody got any issues on the minutes from last time? No? Agreed? Excellent, thank you. All right, so moving on. Item 5, Safer Hillingdon Partnership Performance Monitoring, which is what this meeting really is all about. You will also have had the background papers and some updates. Safer Hillingdon Partnership Performance Report Summary, quarter April to June as well. And then we've also got reports of violent incidents, London Ambulance Service. We can come back to that in a bit. So, who's going to kick us off with this? Dan? Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Dan Kennedy, and I'm the Director of Housing, Environment, Education, Performance and Health and Wellbeing. And within my portfolio is responsibility for community safety, and I'm from the local authority. Okay, so one of the reports that does come to this committee is a regular update on the work of the Safer Hillingdon Partnership. And the Safer Hillingdon Partnership is a statutory body which comprises representatives from the local authority, from the police, from probation and from the health services and other organisations. And collectively, our job is to work together to identify the key crime types, set priorities for tackling and preventing crime, and obviously making sure that we work together to deliver programmes which achieve that. So, and one of the things we do is produce a regular report on how we're doing, and so I'm going to give this committee the headlines. So, in terms of some of the, I suppose, challenges in terms of crime types, and I think it's fair to say that that Hillingdon remains and continues to remain one of the safer boroughs in London, and I turn to my learned colleague, probably one of the safer boroughs out of the three in terms of the basic crime unit. But we still, there still are some persistent and troublesome crime types, so knife crime, for example, and drug-related crimes are one of the bigger priorities that we're seeking to tackle, because there is a link to serious violence with those crime types as well.
I was a bit surprised when we looked at the background papers, and on the first page about targeted problem solving, and I only cut in at this moment because you've mentioned it, where it says that all participating stakeholders were able to evidence performance attainment towards achieving reductions against the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, MOPAC, local borough priorities. Oh, right, sorry, you didn't have that. And then the priorities are set out, and I was a bit surprised not to see drug offences as being a specific item named there.
It's interesting because there has been an announcement recently from the Mayor's Office, and one of our tasks with the partnership is to map some of those criminal activity flows. So within the map, there's some intelligent analysis being undertaken, which maps hotspots in the borough and in neighbouring boroughs, and so that coordinated efforts can be taken to tackle some of the drug-related offences. And just to explain that, because there's been much stronger evidence between the connections of people carrying knives, drug offences and other offences. So it's a web really of related offences. And so whilst it's perhaps in the past hasn't been as overt as perhaps it could have been around the issue of drug offences, the fact is we've been tackling knife crime, which is so closely related to drug offences. The two go hand in hand in any case.
If I could just probably add a little bit to that as well, is that Ricky Candola, local superintendent for Neighbourhood and Partnership Policing for the West area. Just to add a little bit further from what Dan just mentioned in terms of the drugs-related violence piece, it is fair to say that the MPS, working with our partners, are clearly tackling that in terms of what's happening around knife crime and drugs-related violence within the borough. Equally, at the same time, what we're able to do as well is we work closely with our colleagues from Thames Valley Police as well, so that when we look at county line issues and we're looking at what is vulnerability and safeguarding, we are cohesive, we're working together, we're picking up the knowledge from what is happening in their areas that have maybe residents from our area that are going across to do what is, involved in that activity, so that we can not only look at it from a local borough perspective around the hotspots and those particular wards that need tackling and the offenders that need managing, but at the same time, further afield from that, we're quite aware that because we work on the borders of Thames Valley, we want to make sure that we're not displacing of what might be happening within our borough, so we are managing it in a sort of broader picture piece.
But thank you very much for that. But that's likely to happen in anyway, isn't it? Because if you've got within a three-borough area an example, one borough that's very problematic and challenging, and a lot of resources are put into that borough, it may squeeze the criminal movement from that borough because they know that there's attention being had to that particular borough, to the neighbouring boroughs. So there's an almost inevitable, transfer of criminal activity because people are moving outwards from that borough. It doesn't matter where it is. Now, admittedly, the county lines issue is all about people from centres, from metropolitan centres or urban centres going out into rural centres where they think they've got richer pickings or better pickings, where they also think that the enforcement isn't as strong. So it works all the way round.
Yeah, Chair, absolutely. I think in the past, as we well know, there was a lot of that displacement taking place between boroughs. It was almost a case of it was then becoming someone else's issue. And with obviously the basic command unit, for us as a West Area BCU, it's very much about dealing with it in its entirety, rather than pushing it from one borough to another borough. Equally, I think the relationship between us and our colleagues at Thames Valley is far more stronger than it's been before, where we've been actually sharing a lot more information, even with the fact that they have less resources than we've got. We're in a position to be quite smart about how we work together around some of those resources and some of those operations that we've been doing of recent times. That all adds towards that whole bigger picture piece around the drugs-related violence aspect of it. But you know, absolutely, displacement was key. It used to happen a lot, but it's very much about tackling the issue there and then to avoid that displacement taking place. If it does shift from one place to another borough, we're in a position to actually manage it because the offenders tend to be the same.
And so within Hillingdon, are there particular hotspots where you think there's been displacement and therefore criminal activity's gone up?
So there's a lot of work being done at the time as part of the partnership in relation to Hayes particularly. And when you look at Hayes in terms of the format and what was going on, there was an investment in terms of having some officers that were visible around the town centres. Equally, there's been a big investment as a result of the basic command unit in relation to our engagement activities, which have centred in and around the Hayes area. And we've been in a position to do a number of different work. So, not only is it all about enforcement-led, some of it's about the preventative measures and the engagement of, youth diversionary activity that can take place. So that has played a key element because we've not had the level of offending that we've had in the past in relation to Hayes Town Centre or outside of that. Clearly, there is evidence to show there is elements of drug dealing taking place. However, what we are able to do is we are able to work in those key areas with key communities to try and tackle that said problem, and that's paid dividends in that particular area in relation to when you look at the violence picture or you look at the knife-enabled crime in that particular area, and that's been a partnership approach to managing that issue itself. So that's sort of good news.
And going back to my earlier point about drug offences not being, or drug crime not being part of this priority list, does that bother you that that's not being given that priority, even though there's quite a lot of other offences that flow from that?
So I think we've accepted, that clearly, as Dan pointed out, that drugs plays a key part in some of that activity. It would be fair to say that it is a priority for us. I can quite happily sit here today and tell you that drugs-related violence for the Metropolitan Police Service, as a partnership, working closely with Hillingdon, is a key priority. It is something that we will continue to tackle alongside the other priorities, such as robbery, burglary, knife-enabled crime, because it's almost is it a thread through some of that activity that takes place, of which I think we can acknowledge that there is a thread. Drugs does play a part, and it's important for us to try and manage, try and tackle, and at the same time it's about that, looking at what's the alternatives for people that are involved in that level of offending, whether it be at grassroots coming in, whether it be someone that's using paraphernalia, drugs, or it's someone that's looking to come across to, deal drugs on the borough. So we have to look at all of that, and at the same time for us, the vulnerability aspect of it plays in a part as well. So I can talk about certain operations that are taking place in the borough that manage to look at the safeguarding aspect of it as well. So it isn't all about enforcement-led. It's about what can we try and do with our partners to try and look at those individuals involved in that. What brings them into that? How can we get them away from being involved in that? And that's been sort of pivotal and I'd say fruitful, because there has been individuals that have clearly come away from that level of activity. Equally, when a person gets arrested or a young person gets arrested, there are a number of other voluntary organisations that can play a part in supporting that young person. It doesn't have to be a young person, it can be an adult as well, to try and look at getting them away from that line. And ultimately for us as a borough, it's about reducing some of that offending, and at the same time not allowing someone else to come in to then take over what is maybe where we've done a lot of work on, to take that territory over to carry on dealing drugs from another group of people. So it's about looking at the whole problem-solving aspect of it as well. How can we design out some of the stuff that's taking place? And a lot of the work we're doing as well is around new estates, so we can avoid some of the issues that have happened before with some estates where there's areas unlit, or where areas are quite easily available and accessible, to people using it as part of their drug dealing or some part of activity. So there's a number of other measures taking place to try and support that priority, so that we can reduce the other offending that goes with it.
We could probably do a whole night on this, but so I'll just ask this one question on it, because you've raised it. It's quite interesting. To what extent, therefore, do you get involved with the partnership in terms of having any input to the design of estates or of new developments, so that there isn't that, so that there aren't those almost pre-built places where things can happen, a sort of advisory role in terms of making sure that the developments are potentially going to be safe?
Yeah, so we have designing out crime officers within the organisation, and a lot of our local officers that know the local area really, really well, I know have been involved in, so when they know there's housing going up in a particular area, they all make it their business to try and go out to speak to some of the the individuals from those businesses that are looking to develop these properties, with a view of providing some valuable knowledge of the local area. And actually that's played really, really well. If you look at Berkeley Homes that takes place across all the way from Southall into sort of Botwell, we know some of our officers have been involved in when it comes to looking at how the housing might play, or some of the sort of green spaces. What can we try and do to make sure that those spaces aren't being used by others from outside of the borough, and it's being used in the basis that it should be used for. So there are always conversations taking place with neighbourhood ward officers that are probably best placed to manage some of that with some of those companies that are coming in.
All right, thank you. Dan, sorry, I interrupted you. We went on a bit long.
So in terms of some of the headlines, then, so certainly burglary, tackling serious violence are some of the key priorities. Burglary as well, and also doing what we can to reduce levels of domestic abuse and the impact on victims. Some of the key priorities for the partnership. I suppose in terms of what our response is to some of those crime types, there's a lot of work that's going on across the partnership to both tackle and prevent some of those key crime types. And I'll invite colleagues in a moment just to say a little bit more about that. But I mean, just to give you an example, when we're talking about serious youth violence, there's a lot of work being undertaken and planned to work with schools and young people in schools. So there's police schools officers who go out. There are periodic knife archers that are placed in schools. There is MOPAC-funded programs around engaging with young people in schools, so that young people are aware of the risks to them and to others in carrying a knife, for example, or getting involved in drug-related activities. There are also proactive police and local authority planned operations as well, which can include stop and search, can include weapon sweeps of certain areas, and really sort of high visibility presence in a certain area for quite a targeted period of time. So one example was we were receiving some complaints, the police and the local authority, about young people hanging around in Joel Street in the Northwood area, and so we ran a 2-week program, high visibility program, local authority officers, enforcement officers, police officers, and working closely with the schools as well to make sure that our presence was known. And we also contacted a number of businesses, takeaway businesses, which young people were frequenting, to raise our concerns, and they were very cooperative in working with us to try to reduce some of those issues. I suppose as well, so they're quite high visibility presence. As well as that, we've got what we're calling sort of intelligence mapping of criminal activity, so that we're some of which is clearly covert, some of which is building up intelligence in order that we can pinpoint certain individuals or certain groups of individuals, so that we can disrupt and arrest those individuals too. I suppose, shall I bring you in, Jerry, just to say a little bit about what we're doing to prevent and tackle domestic abuse across the borough? Of course, sorry.
My name is Jerry Campbell. I work in the borough's community safety team. I'm the strategic programme lead for violence against women and domestic abuse. So you'll see from your performance papers that the number of recorded domestic abuse matters in the last reported quarter have increased. The stark reality of that is that is in its own a sign of success. More on that in just a moment. So the borough last November launched its domestic abuse strategy 2018 to 2021 with a clear title, quite intentional, around preventing and eradicating violence and abuse in Hillingdon Borough is everybody's business. However, the key subject area there is tackling domestic abuse. So what we have seen through a clear programme of engaging with communities, whether it's through the targeted problem solving sessions or the engagement with in the regular training sessions with frontline multi-agency professionals, what we're seeing are more victims, including repeat victims of domestic violence, being identified and therefore referred to either directly to the police or to other third-party organisations, non-government organisations, charities and the voluntary sector. A significant part of the multi-agency professionals training is about recognising the signs, the symptoms and the red flags of victimisation, and then equipping the frontline professionals with the knowledge of what to do next. Where are the referral pathways? What are the support organisations? So what we have seen as a consequence is an increase in reported and recorded domestic abuse cases, which has led to an increase in the number of high-risk victims who have been identified, therefore referred on to the Hillingdon IDVA service, the Independent Domestic Violence Advisory Service or Advocacy Service, and then on to the multi-agency risk assessment conferences, which you'll see under theme 4 of your performance packs. So we've seen a 26% increase in number of high-risk cases going to the MARAC, and a 23% increase in the number of high-risk victims being supported by specialists. And I think we should see that as a sign of success. A sign of success in that high-risk victims are being readily identified and supported. Because we know that the under-reporting of, for example, domestic abuse and other forms of hate crime means that victims and repeat victims are not being supported. They're living with the consequences, medium to longer term, leading to significant more damage. It also means that dangerous and violent repeat offenders are not being identified early enough. And then thirdly, it means that dangerous places, quite frequently people's homes, are not readily identified to the police and to the other partners in terms of taking enforcement action. Priority number one for the strategy is prevention and early intervention. So there's something about prevention, deterrence, and then prosecution, where prosecution is the right path to take. In the vast majority of circumstances, you'll recognise when it comes to domestic abuse, particularly for repeat offenders, then prosecution is the right path. So the borough is absolutely aligned to the needs around and the prioritisation around prevention and early intervention. And through this 3-year strategy, it will and is being delivered and driven by a 3-year action plan to ensure that the key commitments and promises highlighted in the strategy are being delivered against.
So it's not, as is often the case with statistics, it's not necessarily a picture of an increase in domestic violence. What it is an increase in reporting and identification, which then means that something can be done about it.
Chair, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we should not see an increase. We should view an increase as a positive when it comes to domestic violence for the very reasons that you've just highlighted.
Councillor Riley.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to, very simple question. You spoke about archers, knife archers. What are those? Are they where they can dump their knives?
They're sort of arches that individuals walk through. So they obviously, completely, effectively they're mobile arches, but all pupils will walk through them, and they're a bit like a metal detector. They're just gone.
It's pretty similar to what you see at the airports, basically. So when you walk through, it's as big as that, and then the sensitivity can be adjusted so that we can almost detect what it is that we're looking for, rather than sort of loose change type stuff. And they've proved fruitful for us, where we've used them across parts of the borough.
Councillor Tutwell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just continuing on the theme of the knife crime. So the Q1 stats are showing that we're just about on track for a 5% reduction in the first quarter, which is good news. But how confident are you that with a combination of both the enforcement and engagement activities, that we're going to continue this trend and hopefully even see a reduction against the target that's been set?
So, as a partnership, we've got a dedicated knife crime and serious violence reduction plan, and within that, there's got a lot of action. Some of which are actually about education and engagement with young people. I think the proactive, and there's been a lot of research about stop and search and the impact that's had, and that's been quite significant actually in the borough. That has made a real difference to people carrying knives or dumping their knives, as it were, but also the related crimes such as carrying drugs as well, or supplying drugs. So that's had a double benefit, really, a double impact. I don't know, Ricky, if you wanted to say a bit.
I think the other thing I was going to say was that there's certainly more coming in from the local community. which allows us to, with that information, which is, I could say a few years ago we were, trying to reach out to people to come forward. We're in a position where, we are using our tactics of stop and search far more, in parts of the borough. Having spoken to some youth groups as well in relation to that, it's a welcomed approach. I'm fairly confident that in terms of the plan as we move forward, we are definitely going in the right direction. Clearly there's going to be an element of enforcement that involves stop and search, that involves us in key areas, that will involve going through people's doors, but that's exactly what we're finding out from the feedback from the public, is what they're looking for. Equally at the same time, the preventative measures and the education piece, that will continue. So a number of programmes to talk about will be Your Life You Choose, which has been really impactful in schools. Prison Me No Way, that's an individual that's been through through prison and talks about his own history around going to prison and involved in certain crime types. That's had a lot of impact with young people. Over the summer period, we were looking at putting in place engagement plans that we did do as a borough, which I'd say paid dividends and has been fruitful. Equally, we do a lot of test purchasing operations with our young people, cadets. So all the activity that we've signed up to as part of the Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime has, as a borough, is working in that direction. So I'm fairly confident that those trends are going in the right direction and they continue to go in the right direction.
All right, thank you. I've got Councillor Nelson, then Councillor Dennis.
Dan or Superintendent Ricky can answer this question. You in the domestic, the extended background paper, on page 3, you got the different exercises that you carried out and how it is working. I'm concerned because there's wards target, and rightfully so, but there's wards that's not here and having problems and not being solved. For instance, where the green spaces are concerned, you've got the antisocial behaviour that's taking place and public protection order, but yet still there are some areas where this issue arises time and time again and reported time and time again, and residents feel it's not being dealt with. For instance, in Heathrow on the Bath Road, there's lots of this, canister thing. One of our residents brought a big bucket full of canister behind the Bowls Club there, and they said they called the police on several occasions to actually talk about it, to see the youths what they're doing around there, but they don't get no response, and that is a problem that is happening throughout Heathrow villages. Residents are very concerned that the response from the police, the response from antisocial behaviour as well, is not very forthcoming. So how are you dealing with that? Because you've got it here in the area. You said you've issued public space protection order, fixed penalty notice. It's in here as well. How much of that has been issued, and what you haven't said where it was issued, and that would be an ideal opportunity for us to see a broad spectrum of where the penalty orders is being issued. So, we can say to our residents, yes, this is what is being done and this is what's happening. So can you just update on that, please?
So just talking about the sort of nitro oxide cylinders that you do see scattered around the borough, it'd be fair to say you see them scattered around quite often at quite a few places. So in terms of legislation, it's difficult because we deal with the legislation around supply, and that's what we're looking at when we're looking at individuals around supply. So when we're looking at personal usage, we're talking about actually, them being spoken to about it, and if there's grounds for us to look at further, we'll look at arresting and dealing with them via supply of that nitro oxide. What I can say confidently, as part of the Your Life You Choose project that's been taking place, which I've been involved in quite a lot, is we are, through the drugs process in that Your Life You Choose, a lot of the young children that are going to the schools are being told about nitro oxide, and I've been privy to those conversations. So they will talk about what are the consequences of using that, to highlight in terms of the prevention side of it, if they see it scattered around, and obviously trying to stop that going on. and in terms of the level of, we talk about, call it littering, call it what you want, it's not being utilised in the right, they shouldn't be throwing it, and they should be in a position where actually understanding the negatives around that. There's been a lot of work being done at hospitals as well in relation to the use of that nitric oxide. So, I mean, other than the officers doing around the PSPO side of it, I couldn't give you statistics to say what fixed penalty notices have been issued either by us or by a local authority. What I can say is, in terms of officers coming across that activity in those open spaces, or in some of the wards on the street, they are encouraged to go across to speak to those individuals to ensure that they're not used in terms of supplying, and at the same time it gives officers an opportunity and grounds to search and detect for other substances that are affiliated to drugs misuse. So there is some proactive work being undertaken, as well as targeting some of the younger audiences that are seeing these canisters as part of that Your Life You Choose project. And I know that a specific drugs worker would come in and talk about a number of different drugs. One of those is those canisters that you talk about.
Thank you. Councillor Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to ask something about stop and search, because obviously stop and search is controversial. It has its good side and it has its bad side, and obviously on its good side it's a quick and effective way to try and create an area, make it safer. But on its bad side, it has a history of alienating communities you want to work with deeper in order to resolve problems. And we seem to have this balance of, we do it, then it doesn't really work, we take it away, then we decide we need to do it again, and all this sort of stuff. So is anything being done this time in how we operate stop and search to try and get a better balance?
So absolutely take on board the controversial aspect around stop and search, and there has been a number of changes around stop and search. I think it'd be fair to say that stop and search is a good tactic, and in terms of alienating young groups or young communities, fundamentally, there's a lot of work being undertaken by officers. So when they are dealing with the said individual on the street, officers carry body-worn video. It's been recorded, and then the other bit around the information that's been provided. So it is being recorded. It is being done fairly, and from my perspective, we're looking at it's been done legitimately, ethically, and I quite confidently say that those things are happening. Equally, there is those through the engagement forums, so through the youth engagement teams, through engagement forums that I go to with local communities, we're in a position to talk about that. And I think the view from most people and some of those community engagement events I've been to is they welcome that approach. And it's not a case of we're targeting one audience, but it's the communication. It's making sure that the communication from the grassroots, from the officer going out, dealing with that individual on the streets, is the bit that makes that relationship. We'll work on the basis of intel-led. So we are getting a lot of information from our local community, which I welcome. Long live that continue. And that allows the officers to then go into those areas, work with those people in those areas. And again, they are very much doing that legitimately and ethically. But we'll continue to do that. And I can quite happily say that communities within the established communities and the new emerging communities in the borough, I'm not getting anything that says come and speak to me. We're a little bit disheartened around the use of stop and search for some of our young people. If that was to happen, I'd be happy to engage and have that conversation. You're always going to get a mixed sort of view around stop and search. But what I can say is that in the instance that we've been using stop and search, which has increased the use of stop and search, equally that's allowed us to sort of concentrate around some of the violence piece or some of those key hotspot areas that we have been wanting to target. But it is done. It is done above board, and communities do get to know and hear about it through various forums that I will go to discuss some of those issues. So just give you some confidence around that. That is something that we're not getting, which is, I think that's good news. In other parts of London, there are other communities. Equally, we have a stop and search monitoring group where they will monitor, levels of stop and search being undertaken by the officers, and that allows us to dip sample. And again, everything that's been looked into in those forums has been done, shown to be done correctly. not alienating particular people or groups or young people.
Councillor Lackmarner.
You mentioned the hotspots in relation to drug dealing. How successful is the Met and the partnership in tackling those areas, and how often are those particular hotspots targeted?
So, when we look at we talked about displacement, so we talked about offenders. So, I mean, the key things for me would be to look at what is, looking at the victim profile, looking at the offender, looking at the location, and looking at potentially, the time these offences might be taking place. With all that on board, we're in a position to actually put in place that resource at the right time in those areas. Yes, you do find on occasions there's a displacement between ward to ward. However, we've got a successful partnership tasking team jointly, which is funded by the local authority, staffed by Met police officers. They've been really instrumental in looking at some of those key hotspot areas, and it's a case of not just going in there and looking at the enforcement-led activity. It's a case of working with our partners, and it's a case of working with the safer neighbourhood teams to look at the longevity around that. So we know that we can't always do the enforcement. We need to look at doing other aspects of that. And from you may deal with a group of people, and that you may deal with those group of people, and they may go away for a period of time. However, there may well be a new group of people developing in the particular area. But for some time, what you do find is the issues and the problems do resolve themselves, and then they move off elsewhere for us to then start to tackle. So there is an element of displacement, but I'm quite satisfied that the hotspots within our borough are being managed with a lot of emphasis of going into those particular areas, and there's a lot around visibility as well. So it isn't all about having a covert asset thrown into an area. It's about looking at providing the confidence to the area around visibility as well.
All right, give me 1 second before I go on. Victoria, do you want to come in on this, because I think you deal with some of this, don't you?
In terms of SIM and hotspots, SIM is not necessarily around hotspots and locations, except in where, with the cohort that we have, if they have what shall I explain a little bit what SIM is first? Would that be beneficial? So SIM started in the Isle of Wight, and it came out of Operation Serenity, which was a street triage car, and that was very successful in reducing the number of 136s, which is against the national trend where 136s are continuing to increase, and by Section 136 that is that is the police power under the Mental Health Act to detain somebody for the purpose of a Mental Health Act if they are in, it's now anywhere other than a dwelling, and we have that power to detain them and then remove them to a health-based place of safety for that assessment. And nationally, as I said, and it is the same across the West area, the numbers year by year are continuing to increase. So obviously, just with street triage alone, being able to decrease the number of 136s was very much a positive thing. But they noticed a pattern of a number of specific individuals still coming to notice, even with street triage. And some work was done, obviously, to look at the factors around those specific individuals, and it was decided that an integrated mentoring scheme would be developed alongside the street triage, hence Serenity Integrated Mentoring, which is what SIM stands for. But if you say what it stands for without explaining the background, it doesn't really help people understand what it is. So from my perspective, I am the Hillingdon SIM officer, so I am embedded within the two community mental health teams within the borough, which is Mead House and the Pembroke Centre. I have two SIM trained care coordinators who I work closely with, one at Mead House and one at the Pembroke Centre. So in terms of hotspots, one of the things that we will look at with our specific service users is their crisis behaviours, some of which would obviously be location specific. There obviously has been previous history, not with my current service users, but with others, of sitting on the wrong side of the Aussie Garvin roundabout, for instance. So with our specific service users, one of the things that we will be working towards is to develop a crisis response plan that is crisis and location specific.
All right, thank you. Councillor Rowland.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a question for Superintendent Ricky, but Dan, you probably want to come in. I work very well with my local Safer Neighbourhood team, and particularly the officers within it. And one of the things that became apparent over the last 18 months or so is often their job is hindered by, say, a down fence that the council, on council property, or certain alleyways that have, for whatever reason, their lights have gone out. And they've struggled to get these rectified. And I have to say, all of the ones that I'm referring to now have been dealt with. But do you have a reporting structure that your officers can come to you and say, look, this alleyway or this fence or this access to a particular piece of open space where criminals are running away or using it to deal with drugs, do you have some sort of reporting structure that you work with the council in order to get those things fixed in order to reduce the crime?
So, I mean, I think that's reassuring to hear that the officers are going out and obviously identifying some of those issues, so that, as we look in terms of darker nights and stuff, we can get some of those issues sorted out. I mean, in terms of the officers, doing the job on the street, we look at things like environmental visual audits. So something I'll encourage the officers to do is that whilst we're out and about, if there are certain things that need that level of attention, then please highlight it. So they've all got their channels that go through into the local authority that allow them to get those changes to be made, or fixed, rectified. Clearly, if there was an issue that was far more needy, then it would be escalated to myself, and I'd have a conversation with Dan and someone from the local authority to try and get the emphasis, get that removed. And it may be something as such, leafleting that causes high, whether it's racist material or hate crime material, we would get that removed as soon as possible. To sort of avoid the public, alarm around it. So, a lot of it is based around wall panels when they talk about wall priorities, and some of this information might come about as a result of the wall priorities that have been set for that particular area, where they do the environmental visual audit at the same time. Nice to hear that they have been rectified, but equally, if there were some that the officers felt, actually, I need this, I've gone into the local authority a couple of times, more than a couple of times, they've not been repaired, fixed.
I mean, these particular officers had gone into local authority a couple of times, and it was only when us as councillors stepped in that they were rectified. I don't know whether that information is being passed on.
Yeah, no, I would say that I'd be happy for them to come to me, and then for me and Dan have a conversation. There are, as we all know, there'll be other pressing issues that need to be managed at the same time, depending on what's going on that particular day. However, there is that aspect of, when we look at community safety and we look at our public spaces, ideally, if they're not being well lit, we want them to be well lit, so that people can utilise them and make best use of them. Again, if the officers are finding that a struggle, there is an escalation process in terms of governance, so there is a sergeant on duty, there will be an inspector, before it comes all the way up to my superintendent's desk. I'd be hoping it's gone through at least a couple of layers for the matter to be resolved. But absolutely, my officers will know, and I'll quite happily say it, is the door is firmly open and they can come and speak to me at any time.
But there isn't a system in place where they can report things to the council about particular issues, such as a downed fence, and then people are using it as a rabbit run to run away. Such.
Well, my understanding, there is a system in place that they can email through those details. They can pick up the phone and contact centre. So that system does exist. Clearly, if the system is managing what is the borough's response to everything that he's doing, then that may take a little time in coming forward to get rectified. However, if it's a case that it requires that escalation, then by all means they could go through to the next level, and that will be via an email coming in or the phone call being picked up by the inspector to try and manage that situation a lot quicker.
All right, thank you. Councillor Riley.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm really pleased to see that drugs are now being given the attention that I've always felt that they've needed. I feel that the approach in the past has always been that the police have dealt with the end result, which is the knife crime or the stabbing, and drugs, well, according to all the experts, is the main driving factor behind the violent crime that we're seeing. And it's not just a question of police resources. We all know how hard the police work and are having to do a lot more than they were, say, 20, 30 years ago. There are also wider factors of social breakdown and things are changing. But we've touched on today about the web and the interconnectivity of crimes, and I'm wondering that when a young person comes to you who's been caught carrying a knife, are you simply addressing the factor of them carrying the knife, or are we also looking at the drugs, the other, you know more about this than I do, but the other types of crime? Because if we're just focusing on the narrow thing that you caught the young person for, I don't think we are going to bring about a long-term change in that person's behaviour. And what I want to also know is about the mapping. You're now mapping all the hotspots of drug crime, and I think this is a MOPAC initiative across London. Will the information, I imagine this is costing you a lot of money, a lot of time, it seems like quite a resource-intense process. Will the information from this be fed back through all of the various organisations through which you are collecting the data? Because it's a lot of money. It sounds like something that's very time consuming, and we wouldn't want this just to be something that's published on the internet. Is it going to be fed back down through those channels to actually bring about a difference on the ground? And just as a final comment, the community payback schemes, I think it's a win-win all around. I think we need to carry on with that. I know you've done 15 projects in 3 months, and I think that's the right. I think keeping people busy, giving them a sense of pride in their community, and making them feel useful again is a way to improve their lives. Thank you.
Well, perhaps if I start with community payback, and I have to say we're working very closely with both the police and the community rehabilitation company to step up and increase the number of events, really. And so we're running, I think, 2 to 3 a week at the moment, and we've had some very, very positive feedback from residents to cabinet members about the impacts of those. I think the challenge will be is to try to keep some of those alleyways clean and tidy, and I think actually, but however, I think that residents have really appreciated that, and therefore what we are as a follow-up action looking to do is to do some unannounced visits and checks on businesses, for example, to make sure they've got trade licences, waste licences, so that and that can lead to penalty notices and charges where those businesses don't have, because obviously we want to try to prevent those areas becoming the mess that they were originally in. If I jump to the first point now about young people, and one of the things that perhaps I should have mentioned earlier is a project called Axis. Now this is very much a proactive, intelligence-based approach at identifying individual young people based on a whole range of risk factors, things like exclusions, poor attendance at schools, just notifications that have come to the police, notifications that have come to the local authorities, social services, etc., so that we start to build up a bit of in disparate pieces. It seems like it's not an issue, but when you start piecing them all together, you start to see patterns around an individual, and therefore the risk factors start to escalate. And therefore, through that analysis, what we've been able to do is proactively contact the families, work with the young people to really steer them away from higher risk activities. And that's had a huge impact at reducing repeat offending when they've come to the attention of the police. A massive impact. And it's not just that. It's what that also does. It maps the siblings and the acquaintances of those young people as well. So you start to get a web of individuals who, again, could be drawn into activities which actually are not going to be good for them and for their future and for the community. So, but that's had a huge impact at dampening down and preventing some repeat and escalated risks of young people. And that recently won an award from the MJ for being innovative, and that's MOPAC funding. And so we're looking to continue that, and even we've recently submitted a bid to extend that even further. But that's been quite an important preventative and early intervention model, rather than just treating the problems individually, as with the offence of a knife crime or some other activity. And I've forgotten what your second one was now. Mapping, yeah. So in terms of mapping, we've already got the analysis for the West area. So we know where the hot spots are. And there were a few surprises actually in there, I think, for me. And actually what became quite important as well in the mapping, we've got, I should have said that we've got each borough command has got a dedicated analyst funded by the Met for each area, who's resourced to undertake this and other analysis as well. And there were some interesting patterns in terms of the hotspots. The usual suspects, Hayes, for example, a little bit in West Drayton, Uxbridge, but also a bit in Eastcote. And I say in terms of, what it starts to indicate as well, it's clearly not just a supply market, there's also a demand there. So it's actually how do you disrupt the demand as well. So I think that's leading to some interesting conversations, which again I'll hand over to Ricky just to talk about in terms of some proactive campaigns.
So can I just say thank you for acknowledging the fact that we are working hard. It's extremely the case that the officers do go out to do exactly that. Just in relation to a little bit around the custody piece, so I've put in a bid for a group called Divert to come into the custody suites here in the West London. What that basically involves, it's been quite a successful pilot in other parts of South London, where individuals coming into custody will be met by someone that that will be in a position to try and talk to them about their dealings on the street in terms of what brings them here and how we can divert them in different ways, coming away from the custody bit or going down that line. So I am trying to bring that into custody suites here in the West London area. So a little way off, but hopefully we should have that. So interesting what Dan said about looking at some of the mapping. Yeah, so we've got a dedicated analyst for us here at Hounslow that looks at our mapping, goes into detail around the mapping, which allows us to basically look at that targeted area, looking at those offenders. So we can pretty much, when we look at the offenders, we're looking at the Achilles heel approach. What can we try and do to make sure we're deterring and disrupting those individuals? Equally, at the same time, as Dan mentioned around the East Coast, we had some interesting conversations not long ago where a number of operations were taken on the north of the ground, which meant that not only was it about deterring those individuals around drugs activity, we equally identified there were some safeguarding vulnerabilities around some of those individuals. So whether it was troubled families, whether it was individuals that are out of work, what was the root cause of it, why were they doing it? So for us, there's been far more referrals as well, using our voluntary sector to support some of our young people. Equally, our youth offending teams are working hard to look at diversionary engagement projects that are available to them. And we've had a number of people that are actually now involved and integrated in some of those programs. And hopefully in due course there'll be good news stories that they can share some of their experiences with other younger people in the borough. Long that continue in terms of that sort of partnership approach and that work.
All right, thank you. I've got Councillor Mullally, Councillor Nelson and Councillor Tuckwell. So Councillor Mullally first.
Thank you very much. I hate to take us back a little bit, but I want to just discuss the stop and search a little bit more because specifically when it comes to knife crime and even more specifically when it comes to youth knife crime, this is an area in which I've had a lot of personal experience insofar as a lot of friends and like sort of my community. This was a very, very important issue. And I think a lot of the conversations today, specifically by Councillor Riley and Councillor Dennis, around early engagement, and yourself speaking about early engagement and early intervention is quite right, because my belief has always been that by the time that the young person picks up the knife, it's almost too late, because then you have to deal with it from a criminality perspective. And really, the real way to deal with the issue is to deal with it at an early stage. Now, the problem that I have is, and this is where I'm interested to hear your views, is that you said stop and search works, when the research that we have, not at Hillingdon level, but certainly at a London level and more broader, is that it really doesn't. In terms of the Journal of Criminality, I've got it here, has said that high rates of stop and search were associated with slightly lower than expected rates of crime. And so actually the link between the two is very, very disparate, which is why it's such a controversial topic, in that we have very little research to prove that it works. But I understand for you and your officers it gives you something, a tool to use. The wider problem for me when it comes to stop and search, and the reason why I have such difficulty with it, is that the research also shows that it disproportionately impacts black youths. And that has been the case for 10 years. In terms of, it isn't just disproportionate, it's highly disproportionate, the number of black and ethnic minorities that get stopped and searched. And that causes serious distrust between the community and the police. And that actually, I think, makes the job of police much harder in the engagement piece, because I certainly felt it growing up, and I know the data supports it, that when there is a disproportionate level of stop and search to one community, and often it's the poorer community and the one that's most impacted by levels of youth violence, it is so much harder for you to go into the schools and go into the community and do that level of engagement piece. So I wondered what your experience in that tension is between the stop and search and the trust issue it has with young people, specifically ethnic minority communities, and how that inhibits the work of engagement and that early intervention, because all the data suggests not only does it not work, but it also makes your life more difficult when you go into that engagement piece.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So stop and search, when used correctly, is a really good tactic, and I'll emphasise that again and again. It isn't the only tool that is available to the officers. Clearly, there's a lot of other material that is available to the officers at the time, in terms of whatever is the incident they might be dealing with. But it's certainly a power that is used more and more at this moment in time. And what I can say clearly for the borough here is, I hear what you're saying in terms of black and minority ethnic groups are feeling far more alienated around stop and search, and that that might be a view that clearly those individuals being on the other side of it feel. But for us, and for people like myself and other neighbourhood officers and officers across the organisation, it's very much about working with those communities. And we talk about early engagement. So early engagement has told us, from speaking to some of the groups at schools and other youth establishments, that they do welcome the use of stop and search, and they do come from what is a minority background. They equally feel that the power that's available to officers when used correctly is a good power, because that prevents that individual from maybe being in possession of what is a weapon, or if the officers are doing their jobs and they've got information that suggests that they are carrying something, then they will obviously undertake the powers. We equally, I've done a lot of work. So previous to me coming here and promote, to this borough or the BCU, I was on part of what we said task force that went pan-London, and part of our tactics was very much the using of stop and search across London. And I can remember from my days, and I talked about the stop and search monitoring groups, going to a number of stop and search monitoring groups in a particular area that I was working in for a period of long time, 4 or 5 weeks sometimes, where I could talk about our use of the power, and how many times we used it, how many arrests we might have made, and equally at the same time for us, that when I look at the borough here of Hillingdon, I'm not getting the people with those groups coming back to me saying, actually, we feel the use of stop and search on this borough isn't being used in the way it should be used, or community groups. I do meet with a lot of these groups. We do talk about it quite often, and my view on it is that all of the officers interacting with you will carry body-worn video. If you feel that the stop and search, the way it's been conducted, hasn't gone the way you'd like it to go, or hasn't gone in that way, then there are ways of coming to a local police station or complaining about that stop and search, and then the video can be used and viewed, and the officers can be spoken to, and again, monitoring groups will be able to dip sample some of that as well.
The only trouble with that, I completely hear what you're saying, and I'm trying to be helpful in giving my experience to you. The people who feel like they're being targeted and are already mistrusting of the police, and they're not going to come to you and tell you that they're feeling targeted. So you're only getting a specific response because that's the group that are trusting to come to you. So the biggest problem in this area, I think, is that actually the group that do feel targeted already have a mistrust of authority in general, and specifically the police, and therefore won't come, and you won't hear that. And the second point I'll make is just very briefly, and I think it's just for you to take away. I don't know if there's anything specific in terms of resolution here, but it's not that people feel like they're being targeted. They are they're disproportionately targeted. That's just what stop and search at this moment in time does. So that using it correctly, I'm kind of with you, but the data suggests that they're disproportionately targeted. So I think the engagement with the community is the big piece here. And I always found going through school that it wasn't the metal detectors that put people off, but it was an engagement. And so often you had the bins in which you could drop them without any criminality and things like that. And you know, once you were engaged with that level, and that's where you said the our choice, our future stuff. That's some really impactful frontline work that I know you guys are working very, very hard on. Everyone's trying to reach the same goal. I have no doubt. Like, we're all trying to put a stop to this. It's just about the different routes and the broader impacts things like stop and search have. But I would just be very, very wary that the engagement reactions that you're getting, you may not necessarily hear a certain side just because that community isn't tuned in or engaged in the same way.
All right, thank you very much. We've got an awful lot to get through. I've got Councillor Nelson, Councillor Tuckwell, Councillor Lapmana.
I totally support.
Can we keep our questions from now on?
One of my questions is how you target what the black community is saying in regards to coming and approaching you, and the description that you gave. It's not going to happen because they totally distrust of the police, especially the way they're being handled by the police with stop and search. And I totally support Ali in what he was saying to you. So that was one of my questions. The other question is the emerging estate, the new estate and the current estate. How is it? How are you working? How is it the police is going to stop people, you know, moving from one estate to the other? Because the current estate is still happening. The drugs is happening with different people who lives in the estate. The residents are the one that's suffering in regards to that, and the activities of the police visit is quite a problem too with some of the communities, because when they do call out and you know, saying this is what's happening, a response doesn't happen. And I know there is priorities in regards to response to different things, including my case that still has not been dealt with for burglary last December. So that's still ongoing, still haven't heard anything. How is that going to, the new community, you said that the police are working with the builders. How is it that they're interacting with that to enable to have a safer area for people not to engage or gang up? I just, being mystified by it, because I don't see how you be able to stop that happening.
All right, thank you. That's a very direct question. Thanks.
So in relation to that, as I said at the start, so you've got the problem-solving advisors. They will obviously support and advise. It's not a case of that we would have the fundamental say in it all. They would obviously make their own mind up. But we would, because we police the area, would be in a position to provide some evidence around actually, if they're looking at doing certain things within their footprint or their estate footprint, we can probably suggest actually if you do something completely different or change your doors or, you know, and have an intercom system, whatever it might look like, they will try and do what they can do to make it a little bit easier, not only for others hanging about trying to re-offend or offend, and for us in terms of us going into those particular estates as well. You know, lighting in a particular area, CCTV in a particular area, depending on what they're looking to do. So the officers will make a point of doing it. And I know some of my safe and neighbourhood officers have been involved in quite a few of those conversations or foot walk, you know, whatever you want to call it, a walk in you know, looking at the footprint of it and going through and picking off things that they clearly think is a good idea. Actually, we think differently, and some of that gets changed. which is good to, I think it's good news really, based on the experiences that the officers that bring to the table. In terms of housing side of things, I mean, that's not something that we would look at in terms of who goes into what estates, people, but very much so that, it's a conversation as a partnership we would look at having, and we'd manage individuals that were in that estate. And I'm just sort of covering this as quick as I can, but at the same time, in terms of, members of the public calling in where there is antisocial behaviour or, whatever the offence is that they're seeing, and they're calling it in, I would say that if there's a crime in progress and there's a suspect and offender, at that location, it will be a priority call for us. An officer will make their way to the location. It also depends on what information has been given to the operator at the time, and I can't tell you what that conversation might look like for that individual that you talk about. But generally speaking, officers will, we're in a position now with the BCUs that we can flex the resourcing. So if officers here at Hillingdon are in a position where they're dealing with a critical incident, we've got officers across the other two boroughs, which we're joined to in terms of Ealing and Hounslow, will come across to manage some of the call demand. So that position around dealing with the high harm calls coming in or the offender at the location would get an immediate response.
All right, thank you very much. Councillor Totwell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quickly, just a plug for the community payback teams. I've had two very positive experience, which I know has gone down really well with the people who did the work and also the residents concerned. So that's just a personal experience. My question is, working with high street multinational companies is outlined in the report. I'm just intrigued to know exactly how these companies are working in partnership with the local authorities and indeed our other agencies.
So, I mean, it varies across different parts of the borough, but take Uxbridge, for example. You've got the Uxbridge Business Improvement District, who are very proactive, and myself and Jackie Robertson, who couldn't be here today from the community safety team, for example, we've both been out to see and meet with the manager of Marks and Spencer to talk about, because he had a lead role on the bid, the Uxbridge bid, that he could feed back. I think so. That's one example. But we also work very closely with individual organisations as well in different parts of the borough. And what I should say as well is that certainly in the town centres, across all town centres in the borough, the council has made a huge capital investment in modernising and upgrading CCTV systems. And we're working towards, currently in the process of recruiting staff for a 24/7 CCTV operation, and working very closely with the police. And there's quite often police officers in our CCTV control room based in this building who take part in proactive operations as well. So we also have a local strategic partnership as well, which the cabinet member, Councillor Mills, attends, along with business leaders, Chamber of Commerce, etc. And so there's lots of conversations about listening to businesses about their concerns around crime and community safety, and all of that feeds into some of the improvements we're making. Uxbridge bid as well, they're contributing to the cost of the CCTV operations, and also have agreed to fund a dedicated police officer for Uxbridge as well, working with the Met. So there's a lot going on. Obviously, it is an uphill battle at times, but certainly there's very strong close working between local authority, police, and the business community.
All right, thank you. Councillor Lutmore.
Thank you, Chair. Just a basic question about people that you see begging outside a shopping centre. Is that something that our own enforcement officers would deal with?
Again, it's another partnership approach, and I think we should probably differentiate between those that what we would describe as persistent beggars, but who have somewhere to sleep at night, as well as those who are rough sleeping and genuinely are destitute and have nothing. And on the latter, the rough sleepers, we've been awarded quite significant funding from government and have a dedicated rough sleeper team, and of supporting a number of rough sleepers into a pathway where they can be supported to maintain their own tenancy, so they don't have a need to sleep rough and a need to beg. Although that said, for some it's part of their lifestyle, and so we're trying to support them to avoid the need to beg. For persistent beggars, and we do see, we work very closely with the police. We see there are examples of where those individuals are travelling in on the tube into Uxbridge or other parts of the borough, and who are in the town centres for a day and then go back to where they're sleeping at night. And we've run a campaign where we've tackled that, working with the police, where we've just kind of kept on at individuals, and then it basically displaces people from coming to this borough to beg, and that's been quite effective. But obviously we have to go keep that cycle of that campaign up.
All right. Do you want to? Okay. Councillor Roddy.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd be interested in the police officers' views on my understanding of stop and search. I believe that in the 1990s, stop and search was disproportionately used. I think it was excessive in terms of the levels of crime that we had, and I suspect that members of ethnic communities were being targeted unfairly. My understanding is that today we don't have anywhere near the level of stop and search that we had in the 90s. And I also, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that police have to be able to produce a justifiable reason as to why they have stopped and searched somebody. And did you also say that the whole incident is filmed or something on those lines? Okay, that's brilliant. So, I mean, to my mind, I think the job of the police is to keep us safe. I think it's to help us and our communities feel safe. And I think that if the police are conducting stop and searches and are able to justify every single one, and the person who is being subject to the stop and search is able to question that, I as a local councillor am perfectly happy with the current practice as it is. And if, with the current system, we are finding that members of certain communities are being targeted perhaps above and beyond their representation in the community, perhaps that is a matter that we as a society need to look at separately. To my mind, the job of the police, and the primary job of the police, is to keep us safe, and I want the police to be able to have the powers to be able to do that. I do not want to live in a world where people are being subject to crimes, and that crime could have been prevented with a stop and search.
Yeah, no, thank you, Councillor. So you're absolutely right, body-worn video is clearly there. It wasn't there in the 90s. I can vouch for that because I was there in the 90s in the police service. And, you know, there are, the officers, when they're obviously performing stop and search, they have to give what is grounds. They have to explain to the individual why they're doing what they're doing, and, you know, be in a position to introduce themselves. And that is all filmed on body-worn video. It's a mandatory field, you know, they have to use body-worn video when they are undertaking a stop and search. Clearly, there are, you know, you're absolutely right, we're in the business to make people safe and feel safe. That's exactly what we're here to do. And I think in relation to the communities feeling as they do feel, some of them feeling a little bit vulnerable around the fact that are they being alienated around the stop and search use. I mean, that's disappointing to hear. And I know we talked about it earlier as well. So, you know, my plea to you and the communities that are there and listening today is that, you know, there's a conversation to be had as a community. You know, let's have that conversation, let's discuss it, because, you know, clearly it's a controversial matter, but it's a tactic that, when used well, is used effectively. And, you know, when we look at the increase in stop and search here for our borough, it has led to us, you know, finding various items of property on people that, if we hadn't had the power available to us, then those individuals could have gone on to do some other harm, you know, on various people or property. So, you know, it is very much the case that it is being used ethically, proportionately, and legitimately. And if the officers in any way, shape or form have fallen foul to that, then the body-worn video will firstly show it. The stop and search monitoring panels look and dip sample what is officers recording those encounters as well as the clip. And equally, it's a case that they're in a position to go and talk to the local inspector at the local police station around their encounter as well, so we can capture some of that feedback. Thank you.
All right, three very quick observations from me, and then I want Natasha to talk to her paper. One is in relation to, you were talking earlier on about sort of groups of young people and then sort of reports coming in and then police being sent to that area where the groups are. I'd be very concerned. I mean, one of the great joys of when you're young is to be hanging out with your mates, and I'd be very concerned if we were targeting just groups of young folks who are out there, because young folks need to be out there and be with their chums. If there's something bad going on, I don't disagree, but sometimes older people's perception of a group of young people is not what it actually is, and we need to be careful not to be targeting young people just because there's a group of them. That's the first thing. There's no answer to this. And the second thing is, don't just restrict your, if you are doing, I don't think you are, but don't just restrict your programs to schools, because all the youth organisations, Scouts, Guides, the Cadet Forces and all that, are a great value for that sort of channeling. And in fact, one of the best presentations I saw was by the police cadet force to older people about being aware of doorstep fraud. And it seemed to me that if you used your young folks who are already engaged with you anyway, with other young people's groups, Scouts, Guides, Cadets, whatever it is, in addition to schools, you'd get a much broader response, because it's like the old saying, youth talking to youth. That's why the telephone bills went up. Thank you. Just be aware, and I'm sure you are, of those few things. Natasha, it's a really interesting fair. No, the third one, Victoria, we're going to invite you back to come to one of our, hard luck, because what you do is really fascinating, and we're very interested in it. So we think we can meld that into some of our health things that we do, the health side of stuff that we do. And I think we need to know a lot more from you about what you do. So I'm going to ask Nikki to invite you back to one of our, not the very long, big health things, but one of our general health things, so you can pitch in and help us with that if you don't mind, because otherwise we'll be here all night. Natasha, tell us about this paper.
So I was asked to maybe look at some instant data that might complement some of the presentation that the police were going to be doing. And so I was asked to look at verbal and physical abuse against our staff, to also look at some of the incidents that we've attended around drug crime, drug incidents and knife incidents. Unfortunately, because we are looking at our data from a health perspective, for particularly drug or knife incidents, we don't record the intention behind that. We just record the injuries or what we deal with when we arrive. So we don't have any sort of judgment around that. So to give you that level of data is quite difficult. So, for example, drug-related incidents could also be someone who's taken an intentional overdose, or or an unintentional overdose, as well as illegal drug activity. So that's why I can't really give you anything on that data. So currently, what I can give you, though, is a positive story in terms of instant reporting for our staff around assaults. So if you look at the first slide that I've put up here for you, we looked at the data for 2017. When we talk about Hillingdon Group, that doesn't just involve Hillingdon Borough, that will involve other boroughs. It involves Hillingdon, Hayes, Ruislip and Heathrow, because we don't break our data down to ward level. So in terms of the number of the 33 incidents from 2017, that's the staff that work in that area that have reported incidents that have occurred to them. We've made it easier to report. Where do I point this to? So in 2018, we actually made it easier for our staff to report by introducing iPads, so they could report incidents when they were out mobile, rather than having to return back to station, which historically they'd had to do. And quite pleasingly, even though they had greater access to reporting on the DATIC system, the number of incidents reported actually decreased. And in Hillingdon in particular, they've decreased year on year on assaults on staff. So for 2017, overall Pan-London, there was a 12% reduction. But actually, if you see, there was 33 incidents in 2017 for Hillingdon, 22 in 2018. We're currently sitting at 17 incidents to date for Hillingdon at this time. To try and, well, actually, I'll just move on to this next slide here. So this slide here will break down the subcategories on the DATIX reporting that we do to try and identify any sort of trends, so we can run data around the trends. So if you can see here, you've got physical assault by grab, hand or touch, non-physical assaults by threats of a weapon, the assaulted with a blunt weapon, which is quite interesting. On this particular one was a Zimmer frame, so it's not necessarily, and it's not necessarily some intention, but sometimes it's the type of patients that we deal with. It's probably worth mentioning what we try and do to ensure that our staff are kept as safe as possible. So we have something called a locality alert register. So it's where we have incidents reported where staff have been physically assaulted or been verbally abused. So they're separated out into different categories. So a category 1 incident is where a crew has been previously assaulted, physically assaulted by that patient. And in the Hillingdon area, that we have 2 people that are category 1 patients on the register. So what that will mean is if those patients call us, then we will request the police to attend with us at the same time as going to those category 1 patients. It's fair to say it is quite difficult to get yourself registered as a category 1 patient, because what that means, if you're registered as a category 1 patient, we will write to you, we will tell you we've listed you as a category 1 patient, and we will also tell you that will delay an ambulance response to you potentially. So it's just so that people know. Those people put on the register have a right to appeal that decision. We invariably don't get many appeals, I have to say, but as I say, it's quite hard to be a category 1 patient. Category 2 patients where you've been verbally abused or threatened with violence, but it hasn't actually occurred. There's 1 patient in the Hillingdon area that's on a category 2 patient. And category 3 is just general verbal abuse, which no abuse is particularly nice, but it's just general verbal abuse with no direct threats of violence as such. And there's 2 of those patients. And then we have the category 4 patients, so we will have patients, because of their medical conditions, may have behavioural issues that might be a risk to our staff. And those patients are listed as category 4. They don't get a delayed response, but what we try and do is work closely with themselves and with their care provider, whether it be the GP, to come up with a care package of how best to mitigate the behaviour that they might be displaying. It could be a diabetic or a mental health patient and so on. And there's 1 of those patients in the Hillingdon group. Put there. This slide here, really, it doesn't give you an awful lot of any detailed information. It talks about penetrating trauma, and that takes me back to where I say that we don't look at the intention behind how the injury occurred. So in here will be where people have been stabbed intentionally by other people, but equally it may be where someone has fallen from a height and landed on a spike, or they may have had a penetrating trauma from a car accident where something's gone into the person. But overall, when you look at the data here, Hillingdon is actually relatively low in terms of penetrating trauma overall. And I know the police also talked about preventative work that they do. So we do an awful lot of preventative work, not half as much as the police do, I have to say. But we do things like safe drive, stay alive, but we also do knife crime prevention. And this just gives you the overall figures of what we've done in this part of London so far for this year. And we'll continue to do. So I think it's great to see that we've reached an audience of 3,021 people there. And we'll just continue to do that. And I'm interested actually to catch up with you to talk about some of the work that you do.
Is that coordinated with what the police are doing in terms of their that expression is a different thing, but prevention strategies?
So some of it will be. So we do have a very small team that will do the public engagement type stuff, but the strategy overall links in with what the police do. And for example, the safe drive, stay alive stuff that we do is certainly been linked in and is delivered with the police.
I mean, some of the most effective and impacting talks, demonstrations, whatever, come with examples of it's all very well carrying a knife, but this is what happens if it all goes horribly wrong. And so under those circumstances, it might be useful to, and I know you say you've got a small team, but any of your ambulance crews or paramedics or whatever would be in a position, presumably, to be able to add value in a sense to that sort of somewhat, perhaps sometimes difficult end result. But nevertheless, sometimes that's the impact you want to have. It may be a bit scary, but at the same time, that's what's happening. So maybe a bit more collaboration between the two organisations would be of help. I don't know if you think that's...
Yeah, absolutely. So it is work that we do across all of the group stations that I'm responsible for. I'm not cited on what Hillingdon Group do, but it's certainly something I'll pick up. But we do presentations, and the paramedics will come in their own time, and they come and talk to the children or the teenagers around experiences they've had of dealing with patients that have been stabbed, and they talk about last conversations they've had with people dying in front of them. So it is really impactful when they talk in that language, and I've seen some fantastic results of groups of children absolutely stunned into silence and actually taking it very seriously and speaking to the people as they leave the auditorium around thank you, it was really helpful, and gave them the perspective they needed.
The other thing is that the attacks or assaults on staff. I don't know. I mean, it may be that they do go on to prosecutions and to court. But I mean, is there any record that you keep of that sort of thing, where there are assaults on staff and it progresses, or is there a bit of a culture with ambulance staff that not that it should ever be acceptable, but that because they are in a caring profession, that it may be that the person doing the assaulting has got something additionally problematic with them, different behaviours and so forth, and there's a reluctance to sort of take it forward. But in other circumstances, it ought to be taken forward, shouldn't it?
Yes, you're exactly right. So it really does depend on the severity of the assault. So a lot of my staff, they do have the stiff upper lip, and they will take on board if someone has a medical condition that's possibly contributed to that. The difficulty we have in terms of keeping a track of whether an assault has resulted in a prosecution is I need to rely on whether my staff will actually inform me of that, because the ambulance service as a whole aren't involved in that prosecution. The individual has to put that forward with the police themselves. So unless they flag it to us, and to be fair, most of our staff do, if they are following through with a prosecution and it's successful, our communications team really try and push that out and get that message across, because obviously it helps other staff members if they wish to report it. But it's not something that we ourselves as an organisation can control, but we do everything we can to ensure that if there is a successful prosecution, we sing that from the rooftops really internally across our organisation.
I obviously don't suggest that you're involved in the prosecution, but surely if one of your staff is assaulted on a job or whatever it is, and they come back to the depot and say this is what's happened to me and all the rest of it, then presumably there must be a management escalation that supports that, and possibly that it's the organisation that reports it to the police rather than the individual, because that assists with the additional support.
So there is the reporting goes via the DATEX, but if we approach the police as an organisation, the police would say to us that actually the individual has to come and make that complaint. I don't know if you want to be able to explain that a bit better.
No. So absolutely, I think it'd be fair to say, so if an officer from the London Ambulance Service has been assaulted at the scene there and then, the officers will pretty much manage that there and then. So depending on whatever care might be needed, if there's an assault taking place, well, that's primary. But equally, it may be the case that they may be arrested and taken to a hospital thereafter. And then the follow-up inquiries in terms of taking a statement, there'd be an ambulance off the road, that will happen there and then at that time. So in terms of the provisions around the sort of the care, that will be down to Natasha and her team. But in terms of what happens there and then around that, assault, the officers responding at that time will manage that in its entirety there and then. And then as a victim, they'll be kept updated.
So you would expect the individual. You'd expect the individual London Ambulance Service staff member to report that to the police, rather than reporting it as well as to their own organisation.
Yeah, we'll get notified there and then at the time. So the officers going to a job might be going to a job because the London Ambulance Service has called us as a result of a violent prisoner. or patients, shall I say, and that they've been assaulted as a result of that, and then officers will attend, not only deal with the individual concerned, but at the same time, if there's a care plan that be put in place for the London Ambulance Service in terms of that officer, because an offence has taken place, well, that offence will be dealt with.
And also, we also have on duty a senior officer 24/7 who's responsible for service delivery for London Ambulance Service. They have a direct link into what they call Met Grip. They have twice a day telephone conversations, but equally, if an assault happens on a member of staff and the police aren't on scene, we have a direct CAD link that we can request. So we write directly onto the police CAD link and they can write onto ours. But also that telephone conversation between our senior officer and Met Grip can occur just to ensure, say, if the local police were extra busy, etc., as they always are, it was about ensuring that didn't get missed. So we do everything we can to support that member of staff at the time of reporting it. And equally, if the prosecution does take place and the member of staff is telling us that is going to happen, we will send an officer with them if they want to the court and support them through that as well.
Next time, Ricky, can you and work with Dan? One thing that did occur to us was as we've heard in the recent past and slightly distant past, increases in assaults on police officers. Could you provide something about reported incidents of assaults on police officers within the borough? But not now, but next time.
Yeah, no.
All right, anybody? Okay, Councillor Arnold.
So it was just a quick question to Ricky, because I ask this every time. What are your staffing levels at the moment? Are you fully staffed?
So where are we at the moment? Currently, there are 2 vacancies in terms of dedicated ward officers here on the borough. In terms of response emergency teams, they are fully staffed. The good news is we're getting an increase in new recruits coming to the borough. So only last week we had 22 new officers join us, which is welcome news. And 3 weeks' time we've got 23 coming to us. So we're seeing a growth in new officers coming to the borough. What we need to try and do is match the skill set of officers that are potentially leaving us on development or promotion, to ensure that we don't be left with officers that aren't skilled to get across the borough around driving and obviously the other skills that come in terms of learning as you go through the probationary period. So we're in a really good place, and certainly dedicated board officers we've got 2 short.
All right, thank you very much. We'll draw it to a close there. Can I thank you all very much for coming along and giving us your presentations and views and answering our questions. As I say, we'll see Vicky again fairly soon and to hear from you about your specialised area. But otherwise, thank you very much indeed, and we will now move on to doing our admin stuff. So thanks very much. Thank you. All right, everybody. We're going to have a look at, I don't know if it's here, the work programme. Oh, it is here. Oh, at the end. Here we go, in blue. So, just for Nikki to take us through the rest of our work programme.
Okay, so our next meeting on the 9th of October will be on dental health services in the borough. So a meeting that members have agreed to. We have Public Health England coming along and a representative from the local dental committee.
Excellent. Good.
And our own public health team. So Steve Hadjioff will be here. What I would like to know from members, if possible, is specifically what information do you want? I don't know if you're aware, but the council's social services, housing and public health POC back in 2015 did a review of children's oral health. And there were a lot of issues that were raised then and a lot of data that was provided back then which may or may not have improved. So there's a lot of questioning we can do on that in terms of what action's been taken to improve that, and if it hasn't improved the situation, what's been going on. But I didn't know if there was anything else specifically that members would like to ask.
I think it would be helpful if we got a copy of that report. I know how you think, so, you know. So if we could all have a copy of that report in advance, then we can be thinking about those issues. Okay. Okay, Councillor Nelson.
Can we get on the agenda for vulnerable people and residents and alone those people who are who's low income people? What sort of access dental care? Is there any provision for them to have dental care? You have the NHS prescription, but some people don't even take that on board because of the follow through that they have to go through with paying the extra, and a lot of them don't really take up on the dental care that is offered.
Councillor Maloney.
Can I ask a very practical question? If, by some chance, there's a general election, do we still meet as normal? A very practical question. Yes, no, can I go? No, it's just, I don't know I've never been a councillor while there's been a general, so I don't know what goes.
The consideration will be given at the time as to what meetings would go ahead and what meetings wouldn't go ahead. In the past, we have actually cancelled a whole bunch of meetings because of an election.
I don't know what you mean.
Linking in with June's request, I'd like to understand what treatment people can get on NHS, and for the elderly in particular, do they still have to pay for their dental treatment?
I think the thing to do for all of us is that if we thought up topic heads, let's say, for the dental session on the 9th, can we ping them into Nikki so she can formulate a list of topics for our witnesses to talk about? Because it'd be a shame to bring up something interesting that they hadn't got any figures on or didn't have a pre-warning about. So if we do that, then that'd be great. Okay, happy with that? Councillor Radia.
I can email, but a big issue at the moment locally are NHS dental waiting times. So, for example, if you need dental work done and you need it done soon, you really have to go as a private patient, because if you speak to the various dental practices, the typical line is, we are not taking any more NHS patients. So perhaps something to look at the waiting times for NHS patients would be great.
Is that also an issue with regards to actually joining a practice as well as the waiting times?
Yes. Yes, sorry, Nikki. I think that's what it is, and I know this from personal experience. Sadly, if I've always found that whenever I've needed dental work, it's always been last minute, and given the urgency, I've always had to go as a private patient because nobody's willing to take me on as an NHS patient.
That's a good topic. But as I say, if we think of these things, send them to Nikki and she can compile a list. Okay, anything else?
I'm
afraid
right,
just hang on.
So, before you all run away,
right.
At the November meeting, we're having our health update, so I will invite Victoria to come along and talk to us about the SIM project in more detail at that meeting, because CNWL, who also deal with the project, they're the other half of it, they will also be present at that meeting. There was also a request from members to have an additional meeting to talk about Hillingdon Hospital and developments there, or not, in December. So I need... Well, it was specifically mentioned December. It doesn't have to be December. It could be whenever you wanted it to be. But I need to kind of narrow that down. And finally, the post office issue that we had previously scheduled and it all fell through. That will be coming to our January meeting, and I have received firm commitment, I hope, from the post office now that they will be attending. There are some other potential additional witnesses that I'll be trying to look at for that meeting as well in relation to the same issue.
Good. Any other issues? All right, we'll just hang on for a second while we... Oh, God. So thank you very much for everybody who's been watching and listening, and we shall now stop the meeting.